So perhaps I can kick off. Welcome to this webinar, which is a joint effort hosted by OxPeace, Embrace Dialogue, and the Centre for the Resolution of Intractable Conflicts, Crick. Each organisation is going to give a very short introduction of itself, and then we will come to the main speakers for today. So, my name's Liz Carmichael, and I'm convener of OxPeace, Oxford Network of Peace Studies, which began about a decade ago with the aim of putting the study of peace and peacemaking, peacekeeping and peace building on the map in Oxford and helping to put it on the map beyond as well. We're attached to the Centre for International Studies in the Department of Politics and International Relations in Oxford. We've operated with an annual conference since 2009 and with other events in between, and also training events in mediation and negotiation, which have been well attended by students. We've succeeded in putting the idea that peace is something that can be studied on the map in Oxford. It's a growing subject everywhere. And posts are beginning to appear, and courses that at least touch on the subject. Our hope for the future is for posts and courses, including a chair in peace studies. And for that, we need a willing donor. So if anybody knows such a person, we'd be delighted to hear. So welcome from OxPeace to you all, and especially to our speakers for today. And I'm now going to hand on to Embrace Dialogue.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everyone for Embrace Dialogue, or Rodemos el Diálogo, as we call it in Spanish. It's a great pleasure to join forces with OxPeace and with Crick. Embrace Dialogue is an organization that was set up 8 years ago in the beginning of the negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC in Havana in 2012. Back then, we learned the power of dialogue, and for that reason, we call ourselves Embrace Dialogue. We believe in a culture of dialogue that allows us to talk about difficult issues that usually escalate conflict. And in the last 8 years, we have been growing from an organization that was based in London to an organization that now has many members in Colombia and beyond, people in the States, in Mexico, and in other European countries beyond the United Kingdom and Switzerland. We also have different teams. We have teams working on transitional justice and trying to understand the contribution of the Truth Commission and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and the Unit of the Search of the Disappeared People in Colombia. We have teams doing research on the reincorporation of the FARC and trying to understand how to heal the wounds of the past. And we also have a team doing communications that is trying to explore now how to do digital peace building in an age of disinformation. So we are absolutely delighted to host this event today with these great speakers and to offer this opportunity to you all who have come to join us in this. So very welcome to this event. And now I hand over to Lord Alderdice, who will introduce the event on behalf of Crick.
Thank you very much indeed, Andre and Liz. And just a quick word about Crick, the Centre for the Resolution of Intractable Conflict. Like OxPeace, we're based in Oxford. And like OxPeace, we are affiliated to the Centre for International Studies, which is part of the Department of Politics and International Relations. We also have a number of other connections. We were founded at Harris Manchester College. We work with colleagues at Pembroke College, and we have some important projects with the School of Anthropology, where a number of our colleagues also have appointments. Crick was founded a number of years ago to address exactly what it says, intractable conflicts, conflicts that go on for a long time, that have frustrated all attempts, internal or external, to resolve them. And in a way, you kind of see that represented and represented in a positive way in the three organizations which are working together here, because Liz got a lot of her experience from working in South Africa, and she's about to publish a book about that experience. As you've heard, Andre and colleagues and Gwen, whom you'll hear from later, have been doing a lot of work on Colombia and the peace process there. And as some of you will know from my accent, I come from Northern Ireland and spent a great deal of my life working on the question of peace there in the context of intractable conflicts. And of course, they're intractable until you find a way of resolving them. And that maybe takes many, many decades, in some cases even centuries, before it's possible to do it. But that's what we try to do. And in a way, we're called a centre, but in a way, we're actually more a network of colleagues working in Oxford, yes, but also working in universities and colleges and in NGOs all around the world. And I'm going to be introducing one of the other founding fellows of Crick, Rich Davis, because Rich, based in the United States, is going to be speaking to us very shortly. Well, I'm absolutely delighted, and I know that both I and you are going to enjoy this afternoon, because we've got three marvelous presenters, and I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, but they don't need a great deal of introduction. You'll very quickly find as you listen to them what richness they bring to us. The first is Alan Rusbridger. Alan is also at Oxford at present. He's the principal of Lady Margaret Hall, one of our colleges in Oxford. But he's probably much better known and much more widely known as one of our most distinguished journalists in the United Kingdom, and indeed for many years, I think for a couple of decades actually, editor-in-chief of The Guardian, one of the most important newspapers in the United Kingdom over a long period of time. Guardian's no newcomer, and it's no newcomer to speaking out in important ways. And Alan himself, apart from his work as a journalist and as an editor, is also an author. He's an author of some children's books, but he's also an author of some important, challenging volumes. And one of them, I think it's the most recent one, Alan, What to Believe in a Fake News World, News and How to Use It, which was published last year, has received a lot of attention. The last time I saw Alan speaking, it was on the BBC's Hard Talk with Stephen Sacker, and it was an excellent program. I can't promise that we're going to be as tough on you as Hard Talk usually is, Alan, but it was a really worthwhile presentation that you made, and I think that you opened up a lot of things for a number of us. Rich Davis, Rich is also Rich, a very old friend, who, as I say, was one of the co-founders of the Centre for the Resolution of Intractable Conflict. He's from the United States. He's also got a distinguished academic career and background, including a PhD from the London School of Economics. He has also published, for example, on issues of Hamas, whom he has studied in the Middle East. But he worked on issues of terrorism at the White House, and then began to try to spread his wings to understand more widely and more deeply how we might address some of the serious problems of conflict, initially of terrorism, fundamentalism, radicalization, but now of some of the other issues that are around. For example, he and Scott Atran are running a program at Pembroke College exploring the fragmentation of politics, particularly in the West. And of course, fake news and disinformation is playing a very important role in that fragmentation. Dispersal, devolution, these can be helpful things. Fragmentation rarely is. And then we're going to come to Gwen Burnyeat. Gwen works with Andre and other colleagues in Colombia. She's a political anthropologist. She has also published widely and significantly. She's now working at Merton College and helping us in OxPeace. And she's actually played a particularly important role in putting today's webinar together. So we've got three wonderful people to present to us. And I'm going to stand aside and let them do that. And after they've presented, then there will be an opportunity for some Q&A. I should let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and we will be making some of that available subsequently. And it's also being webcast on social media, as some of you will already know. So without any further ado, Alan, let's come to yourself. We're delighted you're joining us. As I said before, you've published on this issue and you've spoken a good deal about it. And I think I'd even heard that you may be thinking about leaving Lady Margaret Hall to pursue some of these issues in an even more focused way. Well, we'll be very sorry that you do that, but very interested in what you have to contribute on what is one of the prime issues of the moment. Alan, if we were all together in Oxford, I'd say you have the floor, but here I say you've got the microphone, you've got the screen.
Okay.
What you have to say.
I've got the screen. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, John. And it is true that I am leaving Lady Margaret Hall after the end of the summer. I'll have done 6 years here, and one of the reasons is because I find myself getting more and more drawn into this problem of information and information chaos. And the most recent thing I've done is to join the Facebook Oversight Board, which is looking at, one, albeit the main social media platform and how that is handling the issues of content. So I will try and share my screen and hope that I can just take you through a few thoughts that are playing in my mind at the moment, which are really around the issue of trust and trying to answer this question that increasingly, if all the surveys really across developed countries are seeing a huge problem with people simply not knowing what to believe and who they can trust. There's a slide from this survey that Edelman runs every year about trust and a fantastic fall off in engagement with the news. Nearly 2/3 of people saying they now know they can't tell good journalism from rumor or falsehood. Young people especially turning to social media for environment, for information about COVID. Trust in many markets in media is very, very low. It's the least trusted information. Sky News survey there about who you trust on COVID, and newspapers absolutely the bottom of the pile. And there's a survey of the European written press and the press of the United Kingdom, by some way the least trusted. And really, my last book was an attempt to work out why that was, because the easy narrative that we tell ourselves at the moment is that that social media is responsible for all this misinformation and the chaos we live in. And that is, of course, partly true, or maybe even significantly true. But you would expect, I think, especially at a time of a pandemic when bad information is literally life-threatening, that there will be a retreat to the safe harbor of professionally generated news. I don't think that is happening to the extent that one would expect. And we know all, I'm not going to labor the point about the crisis and the economic crisis, in the sheer ability to keep news organizations afloat. But I really wanted to explore in this book why it is that journalism is struggling really to establish that it is so much better than the internet and that professional journalism needs to be trusted. I wrote it in A to Z form, and I'm not going to take you through all the chapters. I'm just going to give you one slide that shows the kind of subjects that I dealt with. So B for Brexit. I put that in because Brexit would be a sort of classic example where you would expect a newspaper would know what to do, that you're asking citizens to take a really major decision on the future of the country. So you would think that your job is to give them both sides of the argument in order that they can make an informed decision. And that's almost the opposite of what newspapers did. The majority of newspapers knew what they thought should happen with Brexit, and they spent the months, if not years, telling people what to think and being very bullying. We'll all remember the enemies of the people front page to judges, but they also did to MPs and to other journalists and other opinion formers, to anybody who didn't disagree. So that was an instance where a lot of people switched off journalism, maybe even people who were sympathetic to Brexit, because it was so obvious that newspapers weren't doing what newspapers should be doing. C for Chinese walls. Again, the story we tell people is that there's a rigid dividing line between advertising, the sources of revenue, and the journalism. And I think those walls are not only falling down, there's this thing called native advertising, which a lot of newspapers are doing, which almost relies on people not being able to tell the difference between advertising and editorial. Journalism, a word invented by my colleague Nick Davis, to describe what happens in a lot of newspapers now, where people are so busy churning it out, they don't have time to do any independent interrogation of stories. Climate change almost speaks for itself. The extent to which so many news organizations were either underplaying it or denying it or resisting it. And again, if you're looking to journalism to be a reliable guide to the way the world is and what's important and what the truth is, then if you've got a significant amount of journalism either ignoring it or misleading you on climate change, no wonder young people are turning away from mainstream news and looking in search of other people they can trust. Editors I threw in because that's an example of the gatekeepers that until about 20 years ago determined what we could read and what we should think. Fairness, a word that has been completely distorted by Fox News to describe something which patently is nothing like fair. Fake news, a very problematic term. Just look at the way that Donald Trump uses it to describe the New York Times and says, really, truth is reality, reality is untruth. I mean, it was a sort of perversion of people's fixed points in really believing that there was such things as facts or evidence, because if he could persuade you that, then he could persuade you to believe in him rather than the New York Times or the reality of what was going on. I threw in F for Freddie Starr. Maybe you need to be over a certain age in Britain to remember that front page. And the point of it was that Freddie Starr, a now dead comedian, ate a hamster. He didn't. This was a story that was published by an editor who knew it was probably not true. And it's a kind of joke. And this, I think, goes through a lot of British journalism. Please don't take us too seriously. It's a bit like Boris Johnson's reporting from Brussels when he was the Telegraph correspondent and would give you a lot of stuff about fake bananas and bent bananas being banned. It's a joke, really. And yet the poor old reader is not quite left in a position of knowing whether, if something is on the front page of a newspaper, we're supposed to believe it's true or not. F for Robert Fisk. I took some individual journalists and thought, well, look, there's somebody who's revered by many people. And I've included his speaking fee there. He commanded a speaking fee of up to £25,000 to give his thoughts. For many people, the main reason to read The Independent, because he was such a prominent voice on the Middle East. And yet I was aware that anybody who'd ever worked with Robert Fisk had severe doubts about his reporting, which emerged only really solidly once he died at the end of last year. I put in G for Grenfell, and there's a picture of the Channel 4 newscaster Jon Snow turning up at the towers the morning after the dreadful inferno. And it was a story really about diversity, that all the journalists who turned up were by and large white, and the people they were interviewing were by and large black. Huge gulf between the reporting and the reported on. But it was also a story about news deserts, the fact that this story had been there and was visible if people had wanted to see it. People had been blogging about it. And I found that really there was only one reporter covering this patch who lived 100 miles away, because that's the economic state of news today. J for journalist, who gets to be a journalist? Is Julian Assange a journalist? Are people who are on Twitter and social media who know what they're talking about journalists? The Bellingcat is this amazing new website that is really expert on Syria and on Russia and many stories, but journalists are very dismissive of Elliot Higgins, who founded it, saying he's really just a blogger. M for metrics, how do we measure what we're trying to do with our journalism? Because if we're increasingly dependent on numbers, that becomes a very significant thing in what our newspapers can look like. Murdoch, I chose a rather unkind picture of Murdoch because that's what he does to everybody else. Try to disentangle together with the next slide, proprietors, young people, again, younger people saying, well, actually, who are these people who own newspapers? Why do they own newspapers? What influence do they have on the views that we read? And why do so many of them still end up as press barons? You've got Yevgeny Lebedev, who comes from Russia, the son of a KGB agent, now in the House of Lords, making laws over us for the rest of his life. How does that work? Why is that right? Sources, journalists, we all need sources, we all need anonymous sources, but quite often you read newspapers thinking, well, it's every source seems to be anonymous in the story. Why should I trust it? And T for the biggest question of all, trust. So those are the kind of issues that I wanted to turn the mirror back on journalism and say, okay, we know the problem with social media, but can we be honest and say that actually in the 21st century, there's a massive implosion of trust, not just in news, in all kinds of institutions. And can we find some of the root causes why people might be feeling that way? So as I say, we could and probably will during this session move on to talk about now my screen is frozen. I'm just going to see if I can boot it down and start it up again. When we talk about social media, there are many aspects, and there's a drama playing out in Australia at the moment about the three-cornered triangle between social media, between the Murdoch organization, and between the government. Maybe we should get into talking about that. And I talked a bit about my role on the Facebook Oversight Board, which is just, it's not looking at all these crises of accountability that social media has around privacy, around the algorithm, around polarization, around tax, around monopolization. It's just looking at content and how you marry the ambition to try and keep freedom of information as wide and robust as possible while dealing with the really problematic stuff that you can find in social media. And I'm just going to end with the trust issue, because this is where it all ends up. And I think this is going to be an issue that's going to not be sorted out in the next couple of weeks or even the next couple of years. I think this is the people who make the parallels with movable type and Gutenberg and say this is like 1450, and we know what the printed book unleashed in terms of political upheavals. We're kind of at the same stage now. This feels like sort of 1457, and it's going to take us a long time to work out exactly where this is going to land. But meanwhile, I think there are interesting things happening which maybe are applicable beyond just journalism in terms of this question of disinformation and how you establish some idea of truth and evidence. So here, very quickly, 10 things that it seems to me in the 21st century we need to work towards. So the first is not to expect or demand trust. That's not how it works these days. You can't just say, I work for this organization, therefore you ought to trust me, because there are an awful lot of people on social media who don't start from that starting point. They assume that you won't trust them or there's no reason why you should. And so therefore they work extra hard with their own techniques, one of which is the link. Journalists very bad at linking or showing their sources. People on social media tend to be brilliant at it. So don't take my word for this. Here's my evidence. It could be a screenshot, could be a link. Go and check for yourself so that you don't just have to rely on me. This leads to the whole issue of transparency, that it's no longer good enough to assume that people will understand what news is, or what impartiality is, or what fairness is, or who owns papers, what the difference is between news and comment. This question about proprietors, why do the Barclay brothers own the Telegraph? Why does Murdoch own the Sun? Why does Lebedev own, what is their purpose? They could make money much more easily by making ball bearings or any number of industries. So why are they in this news business, and what do they want from it? On social media, this question of engagement, when you printed a newspaper, it was a one-way process. You said, here it is, here's the news, trust me. And by the way, I'm not really very interested in hearing back from you. Completely different from the age in which we now live, which is all about response and reaction. And the best people on social media assume that you will want to respond and that they will expect you to respond to them. It's not just a one-way process in which you're handing down a tablet of stone. And that, of course, leads to regarding news in a completely different way. If you're going to respond, then it should stand to reason that if you get something wrong, within minutes, you should clarify and correct it, because otherwise people won't trust you. And people will forgive you a lot if you do that. But if you've ever tried to complain to a newspaper, you'll know that newspapers often work to the opposite way of thinking, that they will try and make it as hard as possible for you to correct. This is the Grenfell point, really, that if, and it's about diversity, that if you have a newsroom that is very monolithic and all looks like a certain sort of person, then people are not going to believe that you can reflect their lives in the way that they would expect you to, and they will not trust you to report on their lives. Tone of voice leads to a new kind of authenticity. I think when you lived in the one-way world, where you had the megaphone or the printing press or the broadcast studio, and you were telling people, then you tended to have a certain kind of tone of voice. And it was very uncomfortable for journalists when people started to respond. And journalists were quite offended and upset at some of the responses that came back. But I think the best journalists have tended now to adjust their tone to be something that is a bit more tentative, to anticipate the response rather than, as it were, just preach a sermon. This question of sources, if I don't know about you, but if I read a newspaper source that has a story that has 20 or 30 anonymous sources, they're always senior, the senior cabinet figure, the senior scientist, the senior Tory, the senior Westminster figure, all these vague ways of describing people who may or may not exist. They probably do exist, but we have no way of evaluating the information because we're just expected to take it on trust. And the one thing we know is that trust is in short supply these days. Two more. One is about relentless negativity. And rather than saying, actually, there are things to be cheerful about, to cherish, to look forward to, and it's almost a distortion of reality if you merely focus on things that have gone wrong and are bad. And finally, in a way, the most basic question C.P. got in 1921, comment is free, but facts are sacred, increasingly, and it doesn't help that we often consume our news on small screens where we can't see labels, or that we get it via Facebook or Twitter or whatever. But it's very difficult now for people to separate what is comment and what is fact. People don't like partisan news, and they trust it less. But at the same time, I think journalists are not in the same place generally, and also they're very bad at making sure that the stuff is labeled clearly so that you know what you're reading. So that is really my attempt to say this problem of disinformation and trust is something that is so widespread. It's going to take a generation to get to the heart of it. But journalism has a really important role in looking in the mirror. And if, as I believe, obviously, I was a journalist for 40 years, that journalism is crucial in a functioning democracy, then I think journalism has to begin by making journalism better, more transparent, more open. And I think a lot of those lessons apply more broadly to people who are trying to get a foothold of trust in society today.
Alan, thank you very much indeed for a marvelous opening up of the issues, and we're obviously going to explore this further. But I wonder if I might just take the opportunity to ask one or two questions to tease things out, and then we'll come back in a more substantial way with the Q&A from our participants. I guess one of the questions that's around for me is whether part of the problem is that the whole Enlightenment process that developed from Gutenberg on, which assumed that we were largely rational beings who therefore wanted to know what the truth was about things and to engage with that, is actually a fantasy. And that in fact, people are driven a great deal more by how they feel than how they think. And so, for example, whenever people hear something from somebody who may not be reliable at all, I immediately think of Donald Trump, but he's by no means the only one, who people know isn't telling the truth about things at all. Even his supporters know he's not telling the truth. But he is telling them things that they want to hear, things that they respond positively to emotionally. And that actually people are at a point now where, for various reasons, and one could argue postmodern philosophy, that actually there isn't anything that's true about anything. And therefore it's your own truth. And our own truth is much more dominated by what we feel than something that disconfirms or contradicts what we would like to believe. And that's as true for liberals as it is for fundamentalists. And that therefore there's a very real dilemma about the propositions that you make, which are about, transparency, honesty, the development of trust, and all of these kinds of things. Do we have evidence, if that's something that we depend on anymore, that actually these things do make the kind of difference that we would think and hope? I think, for example, of Honora O'Neill's Wreath lectures, where she demonstrated, I think quite impressively, that the notion that transparency and so many of the other values that we hold would make people trust society, governments and so on more, actually brought the opposite result from the one that was expected by those who promoted it. So I guess I'm just teasing back a little bit and saying, you're telling us something very sensible, rational, reasonable, but is that actually the way people operate as human beings, individually or in community?
Well, I think there's a lot in what you say, obviously. I don't know if you're watching Adam Curtis's documentaries at the moment, which are baffling in some ways, but completely absorbing, because they're very much on this theme and the growth of individualism and individual notions of the truth. Well, one answer is that it's all we have. I remember when Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, faced with Trump, said, "Look, we're not at war, we're at work." It would have been very easy to just go to war with Trump, and he was such an astounding figure, and he really took the fight to media to say you can't believe any of them. And the only response is to say, well, look, we're not going to fight you on that ground. We're just going to produce the evidence. That's all we can do. We can just say, look, here's a fact. This happened. This didn't happen. This is the truth. That's not the truth, because that's all we can do. And in the end, that's either going to be enough or it's not going to be enough. In the end, I think maybe COVID is going to help us, because I think people are quite frightened at the moment. They realize that actually a society in which you can't agree on, whether people should take a vaccine or not, what's the evidence about that? If we can't get enough people to take the vaccine, we're never going to get out of this. So it actually matters whether there is a truth and whether we can persuade enough people to converge on the truth. So I think the truth and facts won't go out of fashion. I think they will come back into fashion. But how you make people believe that you have truth and facts and evidence is going to be the crucial thing.
Thanks very much. And you've pointed us in a very important current direction, this whole question of COVID and how we deal with it, and whether people believe or do not believe that taking the vaccine will be helpful. And there seem to be major cultural differences there between countries. I mean, I spend a bit of time in France with my wife each year, and the vaccine hesitancy in France is massively greater than it is in the UK, for example. But also, strangely, it's the case in Austria and in parts of Germany as well, which would be perhaps less what one might expect. Fascinating. But given that both you and I have kind of adverted to Trump being part of this, I think we should go across the Atlantic to Rich and to his experience as an observer and researcher, and someone who is focusing very much on the impact of disinformation domestically and internationally. Rich, it's a delight to have you joining us on this webinar, and I'd like to turn to you now for your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you, Alan, for the message, particularly around trust. This is something that's near and dear to the work that we do at Crick. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So the topic of the webinar is disinformation and peace. And the tasking that was thrown to me was even more daunting and challenging than that, which was to answer this question: how does disinformation, information flows, disrupt or impact the stability and peace in countries and between countries, and to create more stable societies, peaceful societies? This is a daunting question, and one I tried very hard to avoid in this conversation. So I thought I was in a better position to actually take you into what is state of the art in IO methods. And IO in this case means information operations. And this is where I'm going to take on for just a moment the idea of disinformation. So it's the title of this talk. Disinformatia, in a formal sense, was ushered forth in 1917 by then Commissioner of Nationalities in Moscow, which was Joseph Stalin. And since then, it has been used as a tool of state, particularly for the Russian state. But I actually want to go beyond that and talk about where information operations are actually going, because as you can see, with even the most recent issues on the stock market in the United States with GameStop, you saw Reddit and a group of Reddit users be able to take on the issue of GameStop. You see Bitcoin out there just driving forward. And so information operations should be understood in a variety of different ways. They are actually tools that armed groups are using, organized crimes using, authoritarian regimes, democratic societies are struggling with them. And I want to take you through at least what is the state of the art today, where it's going, and not call it disinformation, but rather call it malign influence. Because you have the idea of disinformation is maybe there is a kernel of truth in a news article or a story, and ultimately we're going to slightly twist it, and it's going to create this disinformation that advances our policy objectives. Well, malign influence is a whole lot nastier and more difficult and more challenging, because basically what it incentivizes is to take extreme voices, radical voices on right or left or anywhere, and drive them into the mainstream. And there exist tools today, of which I'm going to show you, for how to do that. And so where it's easier to find a title. Computers can find a news title that's been slightly manipulated from one news source to another. Those are anomalies that can be found by computers today. But it's a lot more challenging to be able to attribute to organized crime or to an armed group or to a nation state when you have somebody in your own country, like Nigel Farage, for example, going viral in certain ways, only to find out that there was a massive Russian operation backing those particular messages. Well, you can also find the exact same set of actors pushing the opposite viewpoints in order to fracture and fragment societies, particularly those democratic societies that we're in. So I'm moving us from disinformation to malign influence, and you should understand, at least from nation states, malign influence and information operations are considered active measures. So it is the intelligence agencies, the defense departments of governments, particularly authoritarian regimes, which are out on the advancing the state of the art and what it looks like. And in fact, it's an arms race is the way you should think about it in this webinar. And this arms race is going to have ever more sophisticated tools to where attribution of where information is coming from is going to get more and more challenging. Just think about deep fakes as a construct for that. So for information operations and the state of the art, let me show you the kind of infrastructure that actually exists, okay? So what you have here is a layering network. It's the basis of a network. Now, Lord Alderdice asked me to address, if I could, issues that were either in the United States or even more broadly across the planet. What I'm showing you here is an information network that was involved specifically in Brexit and which is still operating in the United Kingdom today, okay? So what you have here is these blue dots, okay, are websites. These are third-party websites, which might be a nonprofit group, it might be a newspaper, it might be all sorts of things. And then you see the pink here, there are a number of dots in here that are in the background. Those are articles. Those are actually news articles that these websites are linking to. So this is the fundamental basis for where a malign influence network or information operations are existing. Now, the one I'm showing you here is actually a Russian operation, okay? Now, how you layer it is you actually then engineer a number of bots, okay? These are automated accounts in which computers control, and these bots ultimately revolve around the websites, these articles, and they're engineered to engage with specific target audiences. And those target audiences are on both spectrums of the political divide. They're in the business world on different spectrums. They're just about everywhere in every walk of life. We even find some of these bots, for example, operating in vehicle enthusiast groups, hunting clubs, all sorts of places. Okay? So then the next thing gets to where we have cloaking operations. These are semi-automated bots. These are where a person like myself might be in front of a computer screen. I might be running 1,000 different accounts on Facebook, Twitter, vContacte, WhatsApp. It doesn't matter what the platform is. The tools of information operations are agnostic to the platforms. So a semi-automated bot, that is think of it as a program that goes in between your computer bot and the individual. So if I wanted to test, for example, whether an account was a bot or not, I might send a direct message to that account asking to see if that, asking some random question about whether or not somebody is responding. If a live person actually responds, then of course it becomes a semi-automated bot. And that's because computers are controlling it for the most part, but some computer program has been built in order to be able to interface with people when they ask questions back. Now, how do we know with authority that this is taking place? Well, because I have an 18-year-old doing this for us, just to give you an example, how easy it is, okay? Now, how does it work with target audiences? So here is, again, this is in Brexit, but this Much of this network still exists today and is operational. And what you see in green here are the organic users. These are people that are just everyday average people on social media. And this is what a network looks like. Now, if you operationalize information through this and find winners and losers, let's say you're a state like China or Russia or any authoritarian regime. In this case, let me give you a difference of how these things work. An armed group particularly uses information operations for recruitment, legitimacy, and finance. Those are the three primary tools that they use IO for. Organized crime, it's purely financial. Authoritarian regimes, it's about power projection. And then democratic societies, unfortunately, we're tied in legal knots on privacy and authorities generally. And so we do very little in this particular space to defend the democracies that we are part of. And that's one of the research areas that I'm trying to lead out in. Part of the infrastructure is this. Again, this just goes with the Russian bot network that I just showed you. Here are the creation dates of these Russian bots on Twitter. And you can see every day since 2008, somebody's in an office creating between, upwards of 10 new accounts every day. And while Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Twitter might shut down accounts, these were active accounts as of January 1st, 2020 on Twitter, okay? Those that were non-active were removed from this list, all right? So those that had been identified to the social media platform and pulled off, all right? So it's this sort of infrastructure that is being built by a nation state in order to be able to put forth information operations. And information operations really are about persuasion. So I want to show you this video. Stop sharing. I'll move over to a different screen share if I can. Can you see this screen? Yes, okay. So what this is, the different red circles that you see are information bubbles, in this particular case on Twitter, related to Brexit, okay? And what you see here is a time lapse of these information bubbles changing. These information bubbles are the ones that are going viral. And I want to show you the green accounts that are actually moving with them. So the green accounts are Russian Twitter-based accounts involved in information operations. And you'll see over time as a new bubble emerges that you'll get accounts, you'll get bots actually moving into these. Now, you should know that this is not about just Brexit. This is Leave and Remain campaign messaging. So they're on both sides. And ultimately, this is the objective of at least the Russian state, particularly for fragmenting democratic societies. So we see this same pattern in 30 countries. We've done the work. And so I provided this because Lord Alderdice asked me to do something outside of the United States. So the video goes on for another minute, basically showing you the exact same tool set. Now, in order to be able to do this, in order to program bots to do this, they have to be culturally sensitive, okay? So you have to be able to train them with engineered archaeologists, engineered anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists, and psychologists. So that's part of what's happening here, okay? Now, we come back. So in order to be able to, and I put this up as the Russian modus operandi, but really even Disney tries to do this in their advertising campaigns. But what we have found is that there's quite sophisticated efforts. So in the United States, we've been observing all sorts of different debates going on, and our friends in Moscow put their bots and their campaigns right in the middle of these debates, both on left and right. This debate's about gun control in the United States. So what we did is we basically took an engineered approach and scaled the different groups, the different messaging. We created definitions for different groups in the gun debate over here, and then we tried to find where the Russian messaging was actually dropping in to different communities. And so what this is this is a model showing you that somebody who's in the center on the gun debate, what's happening is that messages are being dropped to them, and they're ultimately trying to push them more to the extreme, give them one position or the other, and root out the middle. Now, we have done this not only on gun debate, but we have done this on probably 15 different topics in multiple countries and multiple languages, and we see the sophistication of the operation happening just like this. This is why I'm saying that it's not about disinformation so much anymore as it is advancing techniques and persuasion. And this is a persuasive technique, and we are observing it actually moving people through a progression. So then what is the content? If that's the infrastructure, what's the content? Well, in the UK around Brexit, the top left box here is what are the accounts that are being exploited in this particular case by the Russian bots? On the top right, what are the top mentions that they're using? And you can see here, it's Boris Johnson 1, Jeremy Corbyn 2, both sides of the aisle, and ultimately they're pushing. And down here on the bottom left are those sources, which were the articles that the bots are pushing. So these are, there's nothing in here that says Russian Today. There's no RT accounts. This is BBC, it's the Mirror, it's the Express. There's all sorts of legitimate news organizations for which is being pushed in these campaigns now. And by the way, we're seeing this with every nation state that is playing in this game, whether you call it Turkey, whether you call it Iran, whether you call it Saudi Arabia. Again, the ones that we find woefully inefficient here are any of the Western societies because they're tied up in privacy laws and all sorts of other issues. On the Leave campaign, the most negatively framed entities. Now, this is important because we're talking about persuasion. So we talk about what are those things that they're actually negatively framing. In this case, for Leave, they're negatively framing the EU, the UK, Britain, Deal, and then you can see the list here. What are they doing on the Remain side? It's Boris Johnson, it's the UK, it's People, it's Britain, Nigel Farage. Okay, these are the ones that are negatively framed. Now, another idea about content is a layering technique. So this layering technique, here is a nonprofit that exists in Geneva, okay? This nonprofit has as its primary objective the destruction of the Catholic Church. It is a Russian operation, okay? I have dispatched people to the doors of this outfit in Geneva, only to find that nobody's actually there. This particular news website has 92, it posts news articles every day, has blogs, it has videos of organic people. It basically is an aggregator in multiple language of anything that would actually take on the church as an institution. In this particular case, they also have, so as I mentioned, news articles, they have videos, they also have professional cartoonists. So I put up the cartoonists here only to show you the quality of the cartoons. Now, these cartoons are disparaging of the Catholic Church and of the Pope in a sacrilegious sort of way. And you can see on the top right, I've put something that's up here in Uzbeki, because these cartoons, as well as all of the articles, are translated into 92 languages, okay, on a regular basis. So if you think about just the scale and sophistication of the operation, that's quite large. Now, I point you to that little rubber duck that's in the middle in here, as you can see, just, and it's in every picture, actually. That little rubber duck is representative of the anti-Putin movement that was initiated in Moscow. And so you can see the links and the ties here. But I show you that the sophistication of the content here is quite large. And they take, these kernels of truth and sort of push them. So moving forward, we have we've been trying to analyze what's actually making of an effective message. So in the Remain and Leave camps, we basically took the largest of the messages and said, okay, or we took the broad database that we had of basically 2 years worth of messaging for which we did this analysis. And we looked at what are the, what's making things effective? What messages and memes are moving the target audience, are persuasive for cognitive biases? And what we found is that if you can see, and this is really sort of, I'm geeking out here in the science, but what this is everything on this side of these charts, on this axis, all the way out here, these are things that have gone viral, okay? And in this particular camp, negative framing in the Remain camp is part of, so basically you frame something negatively about somebody, and ultimately you can help make it go viral. There's nothing over here that's negative, okay? You can see the same thing in the Leave camp. Basically, you're framing it negatively. You can also find the same exact setup when you actually put threats to values. If one of your values is you're a nationalist and you believe in the United Kingdom or you believe in England, then ultimately you basically just put those values under threat, and you find the same sort of reaction by people sharing and engaging with these messages, okay? Now moving beyond content, and you say, okay, what are the results? How does it actually, so what? Well, here is the gun debate in the United States. So in the red, these are anti-gun regulation people, okay? So these are pro-Second Amendment folks. And in the blue, you see these are pro-gun regulation folks, okay? These, you know, and what you see in the yellow here, these are Russian bots, okay? Now they are central in each of these arguments because of the tools that I showed you in the infrastructure, and they're capable through all sorts of technical means to inflate these arguments and get their messages actually to be the center and to be the most retweeted, the most engaged with, and ultimately help drive this polarization. We see this in 40 countries. We see this on just about every topic in 40 countries. The Chinese are behaving a lot different than this, and we could discuss that if you want. Armed groups obviously don't do this. They do something different. But in this particular case, it would be easy to say that the Russians are advancing the technology faster than just about anybody else in this space, okay? You can see Russian IO and Brexit. Again, I'm keeping on the Brexit case. You can see the number of tweets and what days they were actually tweeting on. And these, again, are their bots. And we're not talking insignificant numbers. And these are only ones that we know about, right? So we're talking about 51 million tweets over the course of this period of time. Moving forward, you see here is the Leave and Remain trends. Now, this is a Sankey diagram. Again, it's heavy science, but basically these are different groups. And these are bots that are actually infested and solely dedicated to these organizations and ultimately moving them. So you can see in Leave, we've got 154,000 tweets during this period, and Remain, we've got 107,000, okay? And you can see when you've got some blue right here in the tallest column in the center left, you can see some of those blue between this date and this date move from blue to red. Okay, down here into this box right here. And that's partly because of the information operation that was taking place and ultimately tapping negatively, framing values negatively, or framing different topics negatively, or putting things under threat. And that's why you see shifts in population sentiment as a function of that. Again, that's a much deeper piece of science, and we can take you into that. I have two other cases to show you, and then I'll be done. So here's IO in Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is the natural gas pipeline going from just outside of St. Petersburg into Germany. And there was a case, and this is a case about Western governments teaming up against the Russian information operations trying to defeat the approval of Nord Stream 2. And let me just show you what the outcome of that was. Okay, so on Twitter, you see pro Nord Stream 2, that's the Russian information operations. They had and this is over a 10-day campaign. There was 516,000 tweets by their bots, 249,000 different tweeters. They had 98%, nearly 99% of the messages, and they had almost 12,000 bots deployed in Pro NS2. Here are the top English-based links that they use: The Guardian, The Hill, Huffington Post, IMF, of all things. And look at the themes that they published. They published on climate change exclusively. They tapped into what is considered to be a sacralized value across Europe and ultimately pushed that to victory here. The Western allies did traditional media, basically hired a whole bunch of journalists to write stories, put them out there on social media. Total number of tweets, 4,400, had 1% of the messaging, and no bots deployed in this particular case. And if you look at the themes that were pushed, it's really remarkable to me that they did this, even after all the work that Crick and everything has done with our governments. They were pushing rethink the deal, corruption, expense, but nothing related to things that were sacralized by people. In the German language, which was a 2-day campaign that we observed, you can see 97% of the Russian IO happened in German, a little less than 3% were the Western allies. And again, you can see over here the themes that were pushed. Climate change was number one. And on the good guy side in this particular case, if what you wanted was to think about the Western allies as being the opposite side of the coin here, they were pushing, there's gonna be a lot of money laundering in here, okay? There were 27 commissioned anti-Nord Stream 2 articles in 5 languages, and there were a total number of 53 tweets related to those 27 articles. And you can see that the campaigns here are led by individuals pushing things out. The campaigns here are led by computers and artificial intelligence, and that's part of where we see the future going in terms of the arms race. The last case I'll give you has to do with Russia. So what we want to do is get off Facebook and start looking. And by the way, our research goes into vContacte, it's on Twitter, it's in Telegram, it's in every social media outfit out there, platform that's out there. In this particular case, what we wanted to do is look at, in Europe specifically, what were the IO activities taking place with this really sophisticated capabilities coming out of Russia. What were those capabilities looking like in a cross-platform activity? So the only thing that I'm showing here, because just for sake of time and not getting too deep into it, is Facebook and Twitter. But basically, we found 10,000 plus bots working on COVID-19, beginning all the way in December of 2019, by the way, just as it was emerging in Wuhan. 10,000 plus bots on Twitter, exceeding 100,000 posts per day, promoting 36,000 links. Those same links, and this goes back to the layering network I was telling you about, those same links linked to 3,300 different websites. In Facebook, they were targeting 3,619 Facebook pages and groups, targeting 485 million people in what we define as salvos. That's 719 different IO campaigns on different topics using different sources. And all of that happened over the course of about a 3-month period. So that's the state of the art in information campaigns, and I'll stop there. And I could have gone into a lot of different things, but I thought just putting you guys out there, letting you as an academic audience figure out for yourselves where the future of this is going to go and how difficult it's going to be on us and what we need to do with our respective governments to try to compete. Thank you, John.
Rich, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating presentation. I've seen a number of your presentations before, of course, as you know, and we've talked about them. And I think it's tremendous that you have been able to muster the resources to explore these kinds of questions and try to tease out what it is that's going on. But if I might pick up just one element of this, which is in a sense along a similar line to the question that I put to Alan earlier on. The traditional, if I say liberal democratic background, I don't mean that in a party political way, but the traditional kind of way of looking at these things was when you disagreed with someone, argument and debate was good. You took your view, they took their view, you mustered your arguments against their arguments, you had a good debate. You might even have quite a tough debate, but the whole business of debate and disagreement and so on was positive. It was that's how you teased things out, how you came to realize things and so on. It seems, and of course you didn't like people who took a different argument from you and were cleverer in the use of technology to promote it. So in the earlier days of Twitter and Facebook and all of these kinds of things, the question was whether or not the other guy was promoting his arguments more effectively than you. But it seems to me that what you're describing is a move way beyond that into saying, actually, you know what, we can destabilize these societies by taking what they think is their strength, that is the business of debate, and magnifying and multiplying that debate to the point where it becomes not just debate, but division, and which is profoundly moved by how people feel about things. And we can use not just the ordinary techniques of, you know, I write an article, you write an article, but actually you can use artificial intelligence to multiply the amount of disagreement and division to the point where it fragments and fractures society. And of course, one of the things about this, when I try to explain it to many of my liberal colleagues, is they really absolutely don't get it. When I say to them, look, by you putting out a whole series of tweets promoting your view, do you know who's picking them up and pushing them out? The people who you hate the most. And they say, but why would they be promoting my views? You say, well, because the answer is what they're trying to do is deepen division in society. And the more strongly you put your views, then the more helpful it is to their agenda. So that's kind of what I've taken out of not just your presentation today, but how I've listened to what you've been saying over a period of time. And I wonder if you could say whether or not that matches up with how you perceive what is happening and the dilemma that it creates for us about having thoughtful debate or even not so thoughtful debate about some of these key issues.
I had a senior diplomat ask me a very similar question, saying that we were showing that one of the most influential people in this disinformation campaign, again, we're trying to move society away from just thinking about it only in those terms. One of the most influential persons in this disinformation campaign is this notable actor. You want me to tell, you know, our secretary that it's this notable actor who's leading the campaign? I said, you've got the wrong end of the stick. I said, in this particular case, it's very easy for computers to spot fringe arguments, okay? And I mean, we're capable of doing that. The Oxford Internet Center is capable of doing that. We can spot these fringe arguments that are out there, and we can, through the tools, we can make them go viral in different places of our choosing. Why? Because Facebook and Twitter and other algorithms are trying to create groups, right? And it's very easy to dupe those algorithms into working in an IO campaign. Very easy. So in this case, what's happening is that you can find debate being taken away and your values threatened by the other group, which pushes you further and further into supporting folks that may have more radical views. So what we're finding now is that there's a perverse incentive. If somebody puts a really radical view out there and it happens to be supportive of authoritarian regimes' policy objectives, then they can put their machines behind this individual and make them go viral and make them a rock star on Instagram. They can do that. It's possible. So it is creating less debate as a function of that, and placing individuals and groups under greater stress because perceived threats on who they think they are.
Rich, thank you very much indeed for the presentation. I think it shows us some of the size as well as the nature of the challenge that we face. And if we put that together with what Alan was talking about, it really requires us to think very hard about what's going on, but also to try to to draw in and to understand what it is that's going on? Well, one of the things that struck me about both Alan's presentation and yours is how much I saw some of the roots of this happening in the problem in Northern Ireland. The first time I saw Donald Trump, for example, I thought to myself, take away the sex and the money, and this guy is exactly like Ian Paisley, whom of course I knew very well in Northern Ireland. And this whole business of deepening polarization, increasing fragmentation, is something that I saw also at home. But one of the things when you come from a situation of terrorism and violence that you understand emotionally, even if you don't understand the details, is any other situation of similar polarization and violence. So when I first went to Colombia, I didn't need to understand all the details of everything that was going on. And indeed, that was the case in South Africa, it was true in Israel, Palestine, and so on. Emotionally, you get it. You understand what's going on here. And so I'm delighted to be able to turn to someone who spent a great deal of her time trying to understand what's going on in Colombia with the peace process there, what went wrong and what went right, but ultimately what became very problematic about the whole campaign for the peace process. And that's Gwen Burnyeat. Gwen, of course, comes from a background where she studied and thinks about these things, a political anthropologist, but not from an ivory tower. She's gone and spent time working at these things, teasing them out. And I'm delighted that she's going to give us the benefit of some of her exploration and understanding now this afternoon. Gwen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, John. And it's really a great honor to be sharing a panel with Alan and with Richard, and of course with yourself. Herman, if we could have the PowerPoint presentation, please.
Sure.
Is it there, Herman?
Yes, I'm putting it now. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, I mean, it's amazing to hear these presentations already. And I think that one of the commonly proposed antidotes we often hear to so-called post-truth politics is for states to increase civic education on key policy issues to help people distinguish fact from fiction. But as I think many of us are increasingly realizing, and as John referred to in his question to Alan, it's often impossible to counter disinformation with quote unquote truthful information, as people don't form opinions based on rationality. As much neuroscience research now shows, our views are shaped actually by emotions, culture, history, identity, all complex forces and often even contradictory ones. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to tell you about how this battle between truth and lies played out in the Colombian peace process, which sought to end 50 years of war, and what lessons we can learn from it. Negotiations between the government of Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC guerrilla took place in Havana between 2011 and 2016, and the final peace agreement was heralded internationally as the most complete of world peace accords. But in 2016, Colombians rejected the agreement in a polarizing referendum amidst a disinformation campaign similar to those of Brexit and the Trump election the same year. I'm a political anthropologist, and I've been working in Colombia for 10 years. And for my latest research, I spent a year embedded in the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, the government institution in charge of the peace negotiations, doing ethnographic research on the government officials as they tried to communicate the peace process to Colombian society, both before and after this referendum. They created a strategy called Peace Pedagogy, in which officials traveled the country trying to explain the negotiations to different sectors of society. The purpose of this was to prepare the public for implementation of the peace accord, enable them to develop an informed opinion for the referendum, and to dispel disinformation. The opposition party, the Democratic Center, which was led by former President Álvaro Uribe, spread scaremongering narratives about the peace process, claiming it would make Colombia communist, abolish private property, and impose gender ideology on children, turning them gay and destroying the traditional Colombian family. The government officials I worked with referred to these narratives as myths, which they believed had to be countered with realities. While plenty of other researchers looked at how Uribe, whose frequently seen as a populist leader, won the referendum, I actually looked at how the Santos government lost, reframing the debates about how populism works toward how liberalism reacts to its perceived antithesis of populism. I witnessed firsthand the challenges faced by officials in the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, which from now on I'll call the OACP. Representing the government to skeptical audiences and translating the peace process for public opinion was a politically and emotionally fraught task with high stakes affecting millions of lives. So I'm going to share with you 4 of my research findings, then unpack the implications for political communication more broadly. Next slide, please. So finding number 1, peace pedagogy sought to be rational. Peace pedagogy was not planned at the beginning of the peace process. In fact, it's a world first. Peace education is something else. Government peace pedagogy meant dissemination of official information, first about the negotiations, then about the final peace agreement when it was signed. It evolved organically, partly because citizens were demanding information about what was being negotiated. The peace talks were bound by a confidentiality principle, so all official communication about the peace process had to be tightly controlled, as anything the government said publicly could affect the power balance in the negotiations. And this led the OACP to emphasize technical accuracy and to try to avoid seeming political. Officials had to memorize a script, an extensive document which was constantly updated as the negotiations progressed, and their script was accompanied by a lengthy PowerPoint presentation with a clean technical aesthetic, full of bullet points, statistics, and acronyms. As one of the officials told me, our position was always to inform, not promote the peace process. This explaining mode of communication was based on the rationale that the peace process involved a body of objective knowledge on which the OACP was the authority, and that the government should teach Colombians this knowledge. This reflected a liberal belief that the government's discourse about peace was not political, but was based on objective truths. But peace is not above politics. It is inescapably political in every sense of the word. Next, please. Throughout the peace process, the OACP traveled the country, giving talks to thousands of Colombians, especially in war-torn areas where communities would be most affected by the peace deal. They adopted increasingly creative strategies, online courses, workshops with local NGOs, informative booklets tailored to different groups. But in comparison with the rest of the OACP, the pedagogy team was tiny. It began with 3 people, and at its height, it never had more than 12. The 3 directors of the team over the course of the Santos administration, who not unincidentally, I think, were all women, all felt that their work had been undervalued compared with the work of negotiating. In retrospect, many of the officials thought that their insufficient communication with the public led to things going well in Havana, but badly in Colombia, as one put it. Next, please. 2, the attachment to rationality is culturally liberal. Juan Manuel Santos and his senior ministers and officials shared certain cultural characteristics. They were all upper class, from Bogota, mostly white, educated in the best universities and abroad. Santos, whose family is influential in the Colombian Liberal Party, had studied at the LSE and spent many years in London. He was a fan of Tony Blair and even co-authored a book with Blair about adapting the Third Way to Colombia. The peace pedagogy team, meanwhile, were mostly young, middle and upper middle class people from Bogota, also very educated and deeply personally committed to the peace process. They tended to see themselves as not political. They even often said they were not Santista, but they were what I call culturally liberal, as opposed to politically liberal, by which I mean that liberal ideology was embedded in their cultural worldview, intersecting with class, region of origin, race, and education. Of course, liberalism varies hugely across time and space, but there are commonalities, including, which John already touched on, the centrality of the rational individual and the idea that states can improve society using objective scientific knowledge. And this undoubtedly underpinned the OACP's notion of peace pedagogy. So the officials valued rationality in and of itself as a cultural value, but also in reaction and repudiation to Álvaro Uribe, who they saw as a right-wing, manipulative populist leader. This is a global liberal stereotype, the Latin American warlord figure, a charismatic orator, folkloric, one of the people. And it reveals more about liberalism's condescension than about populism per se. Progressive urban elites always want to distinguish themselves from this stereotype. and the OACP's desire to be rational and non-political was therefore partly construed in opposition to what they saw as populist politicking. Next, please. 3. Distrust of the state affected pedagogy reception, and this very much resonates with Alan's emphasis on the issue of trust. In Colombia, there's widespread distrust of the state. Communities in peripheral regions feel abandoned by the state, and the state's been brutally violent to civilians in the war. People's perceptions of the state always affect how they receive government officials. As one official described it, peace pedagogy revealed not just the challenges of communicating about the peace agreement, but in communication in general from states to society. He said, it exposed with greater force that was what was already there, that communicating from a state to society involves trust, presence, being there, and bringing language down from the technical to the accessible. During negotiations, peace became synonymous with the political clash between Santos and Uribe. Uribe's opposition began when Santos initiated peace talks with the FARC and grew over time, making peace pedagogy increasingly difficult. As the team's director told me, we traveled all over the country and we were on the receiving end of everyone's criticisms. The challenges of representing the government in this polarized context was compounded by the fact that violence was still ongoing, including by the state. When police opened fire on civilian protesters in the region of Tumaco, the relationship between officials and pedagogy audiences became further strained. This was not the OACP's responsibility, but people tend to conflate state institutions together. And the officials agonized over this, saying things like, how can we go and talk about the peace agreement in Tumaco when the police are killing peasants? But they also encountered widespread hope. Many communities supported the peace process, even if they weren't pro-government. One official said, the state society was broken, but the peace process was a powerful issue which helped people overcome their distrust to move peace forward together. And now this was easier when pedagogy workshops ran jointly with civil society organizations. The director of an NGO who partnered with the OACP told me, the distrust in the state was evident, but the alliance with us made it less confrontational, because presenting a united front diffused the sense that peace pedagogy was simply government propaganda of some kind. And the other thing was that the elite officials were culturally very different from the majority of their audiences, and this also mattered. The pedagogy team director said to me, I never imagined it would be so difficult to be the government, but also in my case, white, female, from Bogota, and young. All those things count against you. You have to be conscious of them and manage them, not deny them, recognize them. So speaking as the government was already a disadvantage, and the cultural difference aggravated this. On the other hand, it helped when peace pedagogues shared attributes with the audiences. A theologian was hired to do pedagogy with religious sectors, and he told people, I don't support the peace process because I'm working for the government. I'm working with the government because I support the peace process due to my Christian principles. By contrast, a young civilian woman addressing war-weary military audiences found her positioning an obstacle. She said, they asked me, is this your first job? They interrupted me constantly and didn't believe anything I told them. Next, please. 4, communicating from the government is political. It sounds a bit obvious, but I think it really needs to be said. When Santos announced there would be a referendum on the deal, he proclaimed that its 300 pages would be disseminated widely for Colombians to have all the information for the referendum, saying, nobody will be able to say they did not have the chance to know the agreement. This cast the referendum, an electoral exercise, in terms of rational deliberation. Often, politicians who claim to be above politics do use this claim politically to transmit the idea that they're superior to their opponents. Just as Michelle Obama said of Donald Trump's political bullying, when they go low, we go high. In the liberal imagination, referenda allow citizens to choose or legitimate policies, but this ideal of public rationality obscures the confrontationality of electoral politics. And Santos believed he could silence Uribe's opposition by winning, thereby securing the future of peace. But his gamble did not pay off. On the 2nd of October, Colombians rejected the peace accord by just 50.2%. The government then spent 5 weeks meeting with no campaigners, listening to their objections and renegotiating with the FARC. A new agreement was signed incorporating almost all the no campaign's demands and was ratified by Congress. Implementation began on the 1st of December 2016, but the Democratic Centre Party decided to continue opposing the peace accord and build support for the 2018 presidential elections. In this context, the OACP officials blamed themselves for having been too rational and not emotional enough in their communication about the peace agreement. As one of them told me, "We stuck to technical rigor and being faithful to what had been agreed. That prevented us from communicating more simply. We had thought that doing peace pedagogy meant narrating the peace agreement, but the referendum was a wake-up call. We needed to connect with people's emotions." So then they tried a new strategy, working with artists, journalists, and teachers from different regions to create new pro-peace narratives through cultural productions such as songs and graffiti, but it was too late. Uribe's successor candidate, Ivan Duque, won the presidency in 2018 on an anti-peace accord platform. Today, although implementation continues, Duque has been criticized for undermining the peace process and allowing a new spiral of violence to emerge, with murders of activists and demobilized FARC members spiraling. Just like hate crime spiked here after Brexit, so Duque's victory strengthened the climate created by the peace referendum, legitimating hatred against various others. Ultimately, my research showed that while the Santos government expended great efforts in negotiating with the FARC, they failed to dedicate the same efforts to mobilizing society around peace. And I think government-society relations were the fatal flaw in the peace process. Next, please. So to wrap up, liberalism as a cultural system and set of worldviews shapes the logics of many political elites in Colombia and beyond. The idea that an impartial government can teach society about peace and educate people to vote in their own best interests is a deeply liberal one. The Colombian case, I think, offers a mirror to the global north, shattering the fantasy of rationality which haunts liberal reactions to post-truth politics. The project of explaining in polarized contexts fails in not recognizing how political ideologies are intertwined with culture. Next. But there are valuable lessons about tackling disinformation to be learned from the OACP's experience. First, rational communication has limited power to dispel lies, especially in electoral contexts. Second, citizens' perceptions of the state affect how officials are received, and no government-society communication is ever non-political. Third, getting officials in charge of a policy to meet directly with local communities who are going to be affected by it is really valuable. In Colombia, queues of people came to ask the peace negotiators questions themselves, but officials must acknowledge historic distrust and work to overcome it, which they can do by making alliances with civil society organizations who can facilitate trust building, and by considering the cultural and socioeconomic differences between them and their audiences, because the messenger matters as much as the message. Finally, engaging with people's emotions pedagogically is not easy. Political marketing strategies abound which can sway voters, and I actually think that's important and we need to kind of engage with that too, but equipping a society with the tools to make lasting social transformations takes time. Just as violence is reproduced culturally, building peace in Colombia means unlearning old habits and acquiring new ones, and this must be accompanied by the structural reforms promised in the peace agreement. The challenge I think we all face today as we reevaluate the role of information in the post-truth era involves reflecting on this crucial connection between pedagogy and politics, how to educate citizens who can scrutinize governments critically and channel emotions toward better political futures. Thank you.
Gwen, thank you very much indeed for another marvelous presentation, very clear and obviously based on the evidence and the understanding that you gained from being there on the ground. And I think that's really very important. It's always important for friends in Oxford to understand too, as many of them do, that it's not a question of simply picking up the details from a distance. You actually have to work in the field with people and listen to them. And I suppose that's perhaps the one thing that I would pick up with you to explore, because in describing the peace pedagogy, you were describing, in a sense, I think, what the government and those who supported the peace process felt they should do to sell the deal that had been made. And it seemed to me that that was already too late, because the people didn't feel that it was a deal that they had been part of the making of. That's why it had to be sold to people. It's one of the things that was interestingly different from Ireland. In Ireland, first of all, the negotiators weren't taken away to some distant place. They were going back home every evening, and they were talking to and arguing and listening with all of the folk in the community, and spent a great deal of time doing that. Indeed, in South Africa too, there was a great deal of work done within the community. Havana's a long way from Bogota, not just geographically, but psychologically as well. And then when the agreement was produced, this great volume of stuff was, nobody was ever going to read it. Even the journalists weren't going to read it. The people who signed it barely read it. The idea that it could be sold to a population was extraordinary. In the case of Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement is a relatively small pamphlet, which was able to be sent free to every household. And much of it was already known to people, because rather than keeping the negotiations secret, people were coming out of the talks all the time and arguing about the whole thing. So it was, okay, so I wonder what you think about that question of the process being too late, almost by the time it was pedagogy, because the people didn't feel that they were part of the negotiations themselves.
I think that's a really important question. And I think one of the big lessons from the Colombian case is the tension between the confidentiality process, the participation of civil society in peace processes, and the communication or the peace pedagogy. So the confidentiality was really an important principle governing the negotiations, which sought to learn from previous failures in earlier attempts to negotiate with the FARC, when talks had been televised, and it had created a lot of chaos because there was a lot of speculation about the deal. So I think the confidentiality was necessary in this case. And so in order to try to kind of cope with the gap left by the fact that it was all happening in Cuba, there was a very serious attempt, I think, to create mechanisms of citizen participation. So there were a number of large-scale public forums held on every single point of the deal throughout the peace negotiations, with thousands of people participating. And also any citizen or organization could send in proposals to the deal. And the OACP initially didn't have a peace pedagogy team. What they had was a team that was trying to encourage people to participate by sending in their proposals. And they traveled the country distributing these forms which people could fill out and explaining what was being negotiated. So it's not the case that the pedagogy started necessarily too late. They were starting as early as 2012 when the negotiations began. But there's a sort of a big question of the politics of it as well, because these people who were going around explaining to local politicians, local mayors and governors who were asked to help enable participation of their local inhabitants, the OACP would give these forms to them and explain to them, sit them down and explain to them, the negotiations have 6 points, this is what's been agreed so far, this is what we're allowed to communicate. And yet this narrative began to circulate that the negotiations were happening at the countries with the countries, to the country's back. So Colombians had no idea what was being negotiated. And I think a lot of the time it was motivated by political interests. So I spoke to one of the team directors who said that she had personally sat down and explained to all of the country's governors and a large percentage of the country's mayors what was being negotiated, and asked them to help to get their communities to participate. And then a few months later, she would be in a public forum with those same people, and those same people, those same politicians would be saying, the problem is that nobody knows what's being negotiated because the government hasn't told us anything. So there are kind of all sorts of, when you look into it, all sorts of, I think, political interests which also got in the way. But certainly, I think it was a lesson learned that there needed to be more, it needed to have started earlier, and there needed to be more people employed to do this job and travel around the country, because 12 people is not enough to cover 45 million people. As you say, the comparison with Northern Ireland is very imperfect, because Colombia is a much larger country with a much lower literacy rate as well. The peace agreement was 300 pages in contrast to the Good Friday Agreement, which I think was 30 odd. And you know, it's just geographically and demographically a very different context. So I think there are huge lessons to be learned from this about that tension between confidentiality, which is necessary for some peace processes, and participation to make people feel like they have a say, and also providing information, because participation does have to be, you know, it has to be, there have to be parameters within which people participate as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we've got about 20 minutes now to pick up on some of the issues. And there's two things I want to say. First of all, to let people know that while we have been recording and streaming the presentations up until now, we're not going to be continuing to stream the material that emerges in the talk. So if you want to put something on the chat in order to ask a question, far away, but we're not going to be continuing on with streaming that aspect of things. The second thing is that if you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat. Now that's only going to be possible for those who have linked up on Zoom. Anybody that's picking it up on social media is not going to be able to do that. Sorry about that, but we have the possibility of picking up some questions on the chat. Now, we've got a question here, and let me try to pick it up, and then I'm going to just throw it out there for Alan and Rich and Gwen for any of them to pick up about it. So this question is from the Ukraine. And this is someone who does research and peace building in the context of the hybrid war between Russia and the Ukraine. And they identified a campaign by Russia targeted at Ukrainian dialogue facilitators and peace builders, including staged fake dialogues, fake websites, and so on and so on. So one of the questions that's being asked is, have you encountered direct counter peace strategies in other conflict zones? She's mentioned, this person's mentioned one between in the Russia-Ukraine situation, other counter peace strategies in other conflict zones. Would any of the three of you like to pick that up? And if you would just unmute and fire away. Alan, I see that we have you back now, and not just your nice photograph, but your video. Do you want to pick up on that?
That feels like one for Rich.
Rich, do you want to pick up on it?
Thank you, Alan. So what we understand about at least state-backed information operations is that they differ based upon the policy objectives in any target country. So whereas in Western Europe, you might find the objective to be fragmentation, you might find in other areas it's about consolidation of certain policy objectives. And so in this case, I don't have any knowledge related to the Ukraine case building or peace building efforts, but we do know, for example, that state efforts, whether it be, again, those states that are actually active in information operations, it revolves specifically around what the policy objectives are of those countries.
Thanks very much, Rich. So it's not just a scattergun thing. It depends, what are they trying to achieve? And then the strategy is developed and the mechanisms are applied to that. Alan, perhaps this is one that might be closer to your heart and to your thinking. Somebody here is asking a question on the introduction of education on critical thinking to reduce people's vulnerability to disinformation. So helping people to explore, to challenge the material they're getting. Is that a viable way of addressing fake news? What do you think?
I think it's essential. If I were Gavin Williamson, which I'm not, I would introduce this at the age of 6. You know, I mean, the moment people begin to get exposed to social media, I would begin to teach them how they can work out all these questions. Really, I'm encouraging people to ask about journalism and social media. You know, why am I being told this? Who's telling me? How can I independently check if this is true or not? I think that needs to begin really early, so that by the time you're a teenager and you're in a position to choose whether to broadcast, disseminate information, or challenge it, that you're in a position to do so. So I mean, I got into trouble for saying this recently because a teacher emailed me and said, well, we do that already. That's fantastic if so, but I don't think it's absolutely ingrained in the national curriculum in the way that I think it should be.
So here's a sort of secondary question to that, and it's this. It's been put by somebody on the chat here. So we've been talking about the limits to rationality, and there's an emotional dimension to things, and it can get people very passionate and worked up about things that affects how they think about things. If they get very frightened or they get very angry or whatever, that impacts on how they think about things. Now, when you're trying to help people to evaluate, that's a cognitive kind of process. The question that's being asked is it possible to do emotional evidence-based journalism? In other words, can you link in that important dimension of things, or are these elements of the way that we operate inevitably going to be in conflict with each other, the cognitive, rational component and the emotional component?
It's a really interesting question. A couple of years ago, I was in New York having lunch with an editor who was thinking of appointing an emotion editor. I'm not sure if that ever went ahead or whether that would be quite their title, but you could see the point, and it grows out of your point, John, that actually so much of life and politics and information is emotionally based in some way, that actually having a correspondent who would monitor this and write about it because it was such an important was I thought a really interesting idea. I mean, I think the critical faculties that we're talking about can be taught. I mean, I did English at university, and I suppose part of the critical tool set that we were given was to try and work out emotional exploitation and things that felt authentic through the use of language and things that felt manipulative. And I think you wouldn't teach that perhaps at the age of 6, but I think by the time you're 16, you're ready for to start thinking critically about that too, so that you can learn to use rational tools and understand when people are using emotional tools.
Thanks very much indeed. Gwen, I've got a question here, which I think it will be interesting to see what your thoughts are about it, although Rich and Alan may well want to come in on it too. One of our questioners who's putting the question in from Bogota, and puts 2 or 3 elements, but what I want to pick up on, and what the questioner is saying is, there was this period with Brexit, Trump, the Colombian peace process, and all the difficulties and so on. Is this just part of a cycle where we move into all of this kind of chaos and difficulty, and we're going to find ourselves with people getting either fed up with it or overcoming it in some kind of way, and we're going to move out of it, and then somewhere down the line we'll go back into the cycle again because it's just part of the way things operate? Or is there something going on which is happening globally, which is more linear in a sense? It's actually moving from something to something else. Alan mentioned, for example, Gutenberg and what happened then, the disruptive technology, and of course the other things at that time, which were very reminiscent of what we've experienced, sense of corruption and not believing the religious elite, the political elite, and so on, and the change in the seat of authority really at that time in the 1400s, 1500s into the 1600s, where you moved away from princes and bishops telling you what you could believe to ordinary people having the right and responsibility to struggle with these issues themselves, at least to some degree. And what is there some kind of similar kind of progression at the moment? So I guess the question is, was this just a a wave as part of a cycle and we'll move back to a more thoughtful, rational way of operating, or is there something more fundamental happening? What do you think, Gwen? I mean, you've been living and working in Colombia and living and working in the UK and with the opportunity to travel to various places. What do you sense about this?
Well, I think it's a very important question, and I think that the world is changing fundamentally, in particular with the advent of the internet. I mean, my mind boggles when I listen to Rich's presentation about all of these technologies and all of these actors that are developing kind of strategies that most of us don't even understand, don't even have the kind of scientific equipment training to sort of comprehend what that actually means, and let alone think about how to do anything about it. And so I do think that the internet and, you know, the speeding up of technologies has been changing us, and I don't think we're going back to where we were before. But I think that also, and in a way, this kind of picks up with Alan's point beforehand. I think that what 2016 did was kind of erupt it into the kind of public opinion, or, you know, the dynamics which had actually already been building for a long time, and which actually I think existed in many ways before the internet, but just have become exaggerated by it and the speed with which information travels, and have changed, of course, journalism so much, but also academia, peace efforts, and all sorts of other fields. And I think that what was interesting to me about the Colombian case was actually to see that I don't think necessarily that rationality and emotions are so very disconnected as we have assumed them to be, because people get passionate about truth. I mean, people get passionate about communicating facts. I mean, I think that Alan's presentation was very, you know, full of kind of emotional appeals and appeals to my emotions and, you know, things that I should care about. So I think, and I think that the evidence that I saw to support this in Colombia was quite often when peace pedagogues went and gave a peace pedagogy presentation to an audience in a rural area, one of the common responses was, this is really important. We need this to go around all of the rural settlements. We need everybody to know this. There needs to be more of this. More people need to know about this. There needs to be more pedagogy. And it was extraordinary even after the referendum. And even today, I continue to see more and more calls for more pedagogy on the agreement, despite the criticisms that I, as a sort of anthropologist critical of liberalism and liberal peace, make to the kind of rational technocratic presentation. It did connect with many people's emotions, even if they didn't necessarily understand all of it, because they felt that it was a ritual. And I think that something that we haven't really understood, and as an anthropologist, I think, you know, very interested in, is the power of explanations as a kind of ritual of trust building in many ways. And I think that what 2016 did was to bring out into the open something that was already happening. I think it made a lot of us very anxious about this that was happening and trying to sort of understand it more, and get to grips with it more. But I think that what we shouldn't go back to is assuming that there isn't a connection between rationality and emotions. We need to destabilize that binary between rationality and emotions. It's much more complex than we thought. And I think we need to learn from what happened in those three elections, Brexit, the Colombian referendum, and Trump, to improve how we engage with information and move in those gray areas between information, emotions, rationality, cognition, education, and politics and political marketing, in order to try to get ahead of the curve and put that sort of set of equipment toward peace building and peaceful goals, rather than goals that seek to divide and produce conflict.
Let me pick up on that notion of trying to overcome division and conflict. Rich, there's a question here for you. Most of the people that have listened are pretty impressed with your understanding of digital systems and artificial intelligence and how it works in social media circles. And the question that's been asked here is an interesting one. It's, how can we build a digital ecosystem that promotes reconciliation? And I know that your engagement in these things is not because you want to be part of a fight, but because you want to try to build a more stable and peaceful world. So I guess you must have thought quite a lot about this question of how we can actually promote the positive in relationships internationally rather than the negative one, which you've been outlining to us.
Yeah, so to tie it to the previous question too, Pandora's box is open. We recently observed a campaign of denigration, state-backed denigration of a CEO of a bank, while the bank experienced a denial of service attack. It was a concurrent operation. You have the digitalization of videos through deepfakes, which is pushing forward. So one of the very first things that has to happen is ultimately governments who are interested in protecting the democratic society need to invest in artificial intelligence to be able to understand and put up these systems of alerts where something can be determined to be real or not. That we're moving so fast into artificial intelligence, and there's so many computers capable of doing all sorts of interesting things. But I'm sort of, when it comes to what's possible about the protection of society, open society, freedoms, the idea to be able to speak your mind in ways that you want, this is the fight today. This is it. And it's now, it's not tomorrow, it's today. And the wrestling of the relationship of how we deal with privacy laws with regard to how authoritarian regimes may try to find the seams between our communities and our interest in the rule of law. This is the fight. And so I would suggest that that really the sort of resources of the nation state that are committed to democratic, peaceful transitions of power should ultimately concentrate on this problem set, try to marshal the resources of their nation, the understanding of the people of the nation into this space, because it's so easy right now to manipulate. Now it's going to get much more difficult, much more discerning. People will rise to the occasion, I believe, but it is going to be a challenge. And ultimately, John, if in the cyberspace right now, people can spoof your email and send out messages as if they're you. It's also possible that we can have you give a speech today saying something completely opposite of what and who you're about. If the tools aren't adequately developed to be able to defend open society and democratic institutions generally, then they will ultimately fall victim to, some crisis that evolves as a function of these new tools that are emerging. So that's not gloomy or doomsday. The point is, the world has seen evolution of information changes like this in the past that have destabilized only to have new pathways. But the laws around how social media actually handles the content, these things are still in nascent days. Not sure what that's going to look like. So there's a lot of work to be done, just about every aspect of academia as well as the rule of law to deal with them.
Thanks very much indeed, Rich. And Alan, I'd like to come back to yourself, because one of the things that Rich was pointing up was the ease of manipulation and the tools that are now available to manipulate people. Now, I'm a liberal. I'm from a liberal background. I very much believe in that notion of freedom and generosity of spirit. So liberalism for me is about liberty, but it's also about liberality and not just selfishness, my freedom, and I don't care about yours. It's something quite different from that. But I have had two frustrations with liberal colleagues. One of them has been that some of the manipulation that I see being used now by people that I disagree with completely is really not a great deal more than a more sophisticated form of the manipulation that I saw from some of my liberal colleagues 10 and 20 years ago. It was called spin, and liberally minded people on the centre left in the UK were very much involved in that kind of thing because they felt justified. They felt the only way that we're really going to be able to make things happen is, for example, let's try to get some differential turnout of voters. We know the majority of people might not support what we're saying, but if we can try to encourage our people to turn out more than the others, then we're going to get it through and we're going to win. And in lots and lots of other ways, trying to massage and manipulate things to get the right kind of outcome. Then the problem for them was they discovered that the, quote, bad guys were actually better at manipulating than they were. But it wasn't as though they never manipulated. And the second thing, which is kind of connected up with it in a way, is that very often liberals, it seems to me, live in a world where they believe what they wish was true about humanity, rather than what's actually true. So that they want to believe that people are good and rational and logical and well-meaning and wanting to work with others and so on and so forth, rather than saying, well, actually, that's not really the way that people are at all. People are quite a mixture of things. Yes, there are some of those kinds of things, but there's all sorts of other stuff going on as well. And that one of the problems I find myself struggling with some of my colleagues is this living in a world the way you wish it was, with humanity as you wish it was, rather than as it actually is. Now, you've been very much involved in, for example, a newspaper, The Guardian, that's liberally minded, not in a party political sense, but in an intellectual sense. Do you recognize any of those things?
Yes, of course. That's partly why the Guardian has never been a political paper. It's never been attached to any political party, because I think it's important that if journalism is to mean anything, it has to be independent of everything, of all power sources, governments, businesses, unions. But I think what we're saying is that we're going back to the centrality of evidence again, and facts. Maybe evidence is a better word than facts. And returning a bit to what I was saying earlier about, I think the struggle is bigger now because you have to persuade people that there are such things as facts, that there are such things as evidence. Do you remember Donald Trump's spokesman saying, well, we have our alternative facts, the notion of a parallel set of facts. And I think it is troubling that people do currently live on parallel tracks in which you can create a world in which coincides with your beliefs and your vision of the world, which may not touch in any way with a person living in a parallel universe. So the only way to bridge that is with evidence. And the only way to make people believe evidence is by linking to it. You use the things that academics use footnotes, so that people can independently test your evidence to see that it stands up to the phrase, to the understanding of what evidence is. So I think, to go back to Marty Baron, we're at work, we're not at war. There are techniques which are age-old and which are not going to change, and they're all we have, and we have to just stick to them. And in the end, I think they will triumph. I hope. Well,
the final question that has been asked, or final comment that's been asked here, is putting things in an absolutely perfect and appropriate way. The comment is from Lucia Vihar, and the comment is, thank you to all the speakers for the presentations and this deeply insightful discussion. And I would just like to say thank you very much indeed for that, because it has been deeply insightful. Alan bringing an extraordinary experience of journalism at every level in the UK, but way beyond that. Rich bringing us a very rich diet of understanding the technology, which is really going beyond what the ordinary Twitter user understands is happening with his tweets and the ones they receive. And Gwen, who's really been working to understand what's at the back of the good bits and the bad bits of one of the most important peace processes of our time, in a context of violence that went on for many decades. Many people in the West do not understand how long the Colombian conflict went on for and how many people were affected by it. It's quite extraordinary. I find, come from Northern Ireland, and everybody knows about this piddling little place that had this conflict going on. And there were millions of victims in Colombia, not all millions that were killed, but many millions of people that suffered from the violence which went on for many decades. So you've devoted yourself to understanding that, and I think you've brought some really important insights, not just about the conflict, but about the peace process and its challenges. All three of you have been extremely helpful to us in exploring this very difficult set of questions about facts, evidence, distrust, disinformation, the way it is skewing our relationships, and the way we face a very troubling time. So can I, on behalf of our colleagues in Crick and in OxPeace, and indeed our colleagues in Colombia, thank you very much indeed for all of you who've been helpful in putting it together, and particularly for those three presenters, and indeed for those that have been asking the questions, listening to them, and without any doubt in my mind, taking away from this webinar some really interesting questions and stimulus for further thought. Alan, Rich, Gwen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we shall be back in touch with you all, because now we have your contact details. We're not going to let you go. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.